Okay, I'm going to start talking. Is anybody else still writing? Okay. So what I'm going to share today or propose today are a proposition for a poetics of post-memory, using the example of the poetry by the descendants of Japanese American incarceration. And I passed out a list, or had Jay pass out a list, of some of the poets I'm going to be talking about. I'm not really going to go into any real depth on any of these poets, but I'm just sort of using the idea of Japanese American poetry to work through a larger idea. And we'll get back to the ancestor question later in the talk. If insanity, as Einstein allegedly defined it, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results each time, then is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting the same result each time the definition of sanity. At some point in our lives, we discover through a combination of paranoia, ecstasy, terror, despair, and déjà vu, aka consciousness, that life is a process of doing the same thing over and over again, and that the only way to assuage the insanity that results from this discovery and this process is by making of the repetition and its futility a ritual space. Think of Sisyphus, whose sentence of pushing a rock up a hill only to have it roll each time back down bears an uncanny resemblance to the work of the writer. But think of the interval in which Sisyphus walks back down the hill and the view that is permitted in that interval. It is what Camus calls the hour of consciousness. I'm going to share some thoughts today about our relationships with history, as well as some thoughts on how to write into these relationships. By history, I partly mean national and cultural history, but I mostly mean communal, ancestral, and familial history. I've been thinking especially about the relationships we form with a specific kind of history, that which took place before we were born, and yet about which we feel the intimacy and the pressure of a memory. Marianne Hirsch, who is a scholar of the transmission of memories of violence, refers to this relationship as post-memory. Post-memory is the relationship that the generation after bears to the personal, collective, and cultural trauma of those who came before. The relationship they bear to experiences they remember by means of stories, images, and behaviors that have been transmitted so deeply as to constitute memories in their own right. Post-memory is mediated, in Marianne Hirsch's conception, not by recall, but by imaginative investment, projection, and creation. How do or can we write about individuals we have never met, but to whom we feel an intense connection? So that's the first main question. How do or can we write about an experience or event, a communal or ancestral trauma, for example, that happened prior to our being born, yet about which we feel the intimacy and pressure of a memory? And what are the ethics of doing so? In thinking through these questions, I'm going to use as an example the poetry of Japanese American incarceration, in particular by the Sansei and Yonsei third and fourth generation descendants of incarceration, those who were not there. This is who I am, this is what I write. This is going to be less about specific poets or books or poems or even genres, and more about the ways we might orient ourselves and our work in relation to what is under constant threat of being erased. So here is a very crude paraphrase of Japanese American incarceration poetry. The poetry of Japanese American incarceration has passed through two phases, is now in its third. The first phase, poetry written in camp. And again, we can transpose this upon any kind of cultural or ancestral trauma or experience. The second phase is poetry by poets who were incarcerated when they were children, who returned to their experiences years later through poetry. The third phase, poetry written by those who were not there. That is the present phase, and will soon become actually the only phase, maybe the eternal phase. This phase is characterized by an obsessive-compulsive need to re-examine the past, and to do so by returning over and over again to the ruins. By ruins, I mean everything that has grown and overgrown in the afterlife of an experience or event. These behaviors are, in this sense, synonymous with writing, with poetry, in that poetry is also a perpetual because irresolvable return, out of which might be harvested flashes of consciousness that could be converted through language into literature. So I've handed out a list of poets of this third phase, including David Mura, Heather Nagami, Brian Comey Dempster, Bryn Saito, Christine Catano, W. Todd Kaneko, and Mia Ayumi Malhotra. Is anyone familiar with any of these poets? One. Which of these poets have you heard of? David Mura. Yeah, so he's a Sansei, third generation. He's of the older of this third phase. And he's written a lot of books of poetry. He's written wonderful, beautiful memoirs, and in every one, he in some way touches upon this history. The work of these poets attests to being fated. They are beings fated to reenact their ancestors' arrest in order to redirect it, to create new neural pathways. These poets are haunted and sentenced by their hauntedness. So I want to return to those two questions I asked. I want you to write down the first name or names or people or community that comes to mind when I say an individual or individuals you have never met, but to whom you feel an intense connection. So I want you to write down the name or names of the first things that come to your mind when I say an individual or individuals you have never met, but to whom you feel an intense connection. And we're partly in the realm of our ancestors, so you could start by thinking there. But the first name or names, they don't have to be like proper names. They could be a general collective or a pronoun or an idea. And when I say first that comes to mind, I'm really asking you to not think that much, to just intuitively respond to that. And if nothing comes to mind, that's valid as well. So after that, then I want you to write down the first experience or event, historical or otherwise, that comes to mind when I say an experience or event that happened prior to you being born, yet about which you feel the intimacy and pressure of a memory. AKA something to which you feel you have a relationship. So we'll return to these questions also later in the talk. So here's a list of 30 propositions, thoughts, theories, suggestions, examples for a poetics of post-memory, moving in and out of the example of the poetry of Japanese American incarceration. And 30 can help you count down, keep track of how long this is going. 1, the work of post-memory is related to the fracture of the soul in the time of its embodiment and its dispersal into the future, where it is received by the consciousness of the descendant. The descendant, us perhaps, is chosen, but the descendant also has a choice to either refuse or neglect the fractured soul or reconstitute and cultivate it. 2, the meaning of an experience may or may not be realized in the time it first occurred, but may require one or several generations in order to process itself, or be processed by someone else or a community outside itself, which may require, in turn, deep inquiry, research, reenactment, enchantment, somatic engaging, a kind of haunting in reverse. Poetry, for example, is a method of translating an unrealized experience into an interactive panorama. 3, the work of a poet, especially a descendant of trauma, is the work of pilgrimage. Life is a pilgrimage. The pilgrimage is to trauma's source, which is often indistinguishable from the pilgrimage itself. And because the pilgrimage is repetitive, often futile and without end, it can be and often is hellish. 4, consider Izanagi. Izanagi is the model for hellish pilgrimage and the anti-model for the resuscitation of the dead. The story is this: Izanagi and Izanami are the brother and sister gods who created Japan. Izanami is banished to the underworld, into which Izanagi descends to rescue her. This is very similar to the Orpheus Eurydice myth. Izanagi breaks the promise of not looking at his sister Izanami. He shines a fire in her face, which transforms her into a corpse-like hell hag crawling with maggots. Arrested in trauma, doubly arrested in memory, triply arrested in poetry, the ancestors are, like Izanami, transformed into corpse-like hell hags crawling with maggots, and are indentured to perform their arrest for those who cannot help but shine a light in their face. In other words, do not reduce the ancestors to those moments which serve your narrative and understanding of their lives. Do not condemn the ancestors to becoming corpse-like hell hags crawling with maggots. But if they do become corpse-like hell hags crawling with maggots, do not turn away. Give yourself over to them in their hell haggardness. Izanagi is Izanagi. Izanami is the same, but with an M instead of a G. 5. Lawson Fusao Inada, a poet of the second phase and the former poet laureate of Oregon, provided a methodology for Japanese American poets when he wrote in his poem Camp, "So you might say I've taken the camp experience in my hands, stood it in the sun, and held it up to the light. Instead of holding history up to the light, however, hold it up or down or go down with it into the dark and stay there." 6. You'll see it for yourself when you go there roving with your questions for the barracks, writes Bryn Saito in Alma, 1942, a poem memorializing her grandmother who was incarcerated in Gila River, Arizona. 7, determine your questions. Determine who and or what your questions are for. Think of questions as having been formed not by the curiosity of a lone living individual, aka you, but by the dead, whose answers, in their disenfranchisement, have been cannibalized and scattered and are waiting for you to be recollected. 8, consider this question and these answers from Bryn Saito's 13 Ways of Looking at a Teacher resource, a poem which is in the most recent issue of the Volta. Question: how do you make meaning from the past? Answer: see the writer again at the gate of memory. See the writer again. See the writer again at the gate. Gate the writer again at the memory. Gate the writer. See the past again at the meaning gate. Past the meaning. Past the making. Gate the memory. See the meaning. She should drown it. 9. Determine for yourself the location of the gate of memory. 10. Determine the pilgrimage or pilgrimages you need to make. As I said, the pilgrimage is often to trauma's source, but it is also fixated on an object, which often exists in a place, and yet a place from which, when you arrive, has likely already disappeared. 11. Determine what and where in your life are the ruins. Ruins are as much personal and behavioral as they are archaeological and geographical. 12. Determine what and where in your life are the graves. 13. A grave is anywhere we leave an unrepeatable part of ourselves, a part that has been arrested or has broken away. But a grave must be identified, and it must affirm that yes, someone or something, a life or lives or part of a life, has been arrested or has broken away. Then the grave will become energized with the potential of becoming a ritual grave, which is where the living go to visit the dead, and which bears the responsibility of emanating and animating history into a limitless future. 14. A grave exists and only ever exists in the present, therefore must be maintained and honored in the present, therefore must be constantly renewed. 15. Ritual graves can take many forms: an altar, a river, a hole in a wall, a library, a book, a photograph, an object, a person, an aspect of that person. 16. Take the ruins, take the pilgrimage to the ruins, take the grave or graves, and transform them together into a space you can enter and exit at will. I want to pause here to acknowledge the fact that we will one day be that which is unknown. That we will be on the shadow side of the gate of memory. That our experiences will be marked or unmarked in the ruins by a grave or not, and that we will be the object on which a future pilgrimage fixates and maybe fails to reach. So here's an exercise, a physical exercise that might connect us to the future while hanging us over an oddly embodied sense of timelessness. So I'm going to move off camera. So I want everybody to touch their skull. And by that I mean I really want you to touch your your jaw. Try to clear away anything that is not skull. And really see it. And even the back of your head. Where that transition where like suddenly your neck begins. And I suppose our teeth are also part of our skull. So I want to spend I'll return to this later as well. I want to spend a few minutes hearing what people wrote to the question, what in your definition is an ancestor? And we'll maybe just have a few people volunteer their answers. Yeah.
For me, I wrote ancestors, to me personally, are the group of people to which I can trace my lineage. And for some reason, I've always felt that to be an important part of life, is kind of knowing where you came from and how you got here.
Sure.
The unknown and known histories, bloodline, stories, and lineage of genetics and confluence of and for my being.
Confluence.
I wrote that my ancestors are my building blocks to who/what I am. My relationship eventually with them is one of acceptance because I can't deny them. And I've tried.
Wow. Okay, that's good. Yeah.
I wrote, all of our species who came before me. Some I know better through family, relation, and culture.
Those I am related to either biologically or through circumstance.
Circumstantial interest.
This is kind of a difficult one for me because familially, I don't really have a sense of ancestor. To me, like, I put down a long gone member of my bloodline. Like, to me, like you were saying, you know, the shadow of a date of memory, like, ancestor is something that is gone. Like, there is a lost aspect to it. And in my personal life, I don't really have any of that. I don't have that knowledge of my world. So it's kind of estranged to me.
So there's obviously some overlap with this question, but what is your relationship with your ancestors? So it's maybe being unknown in the future, like I said. But in a sense, it's really up to the living to decide who is imperative to search for, right?
I might make it easier for great-grandchildren, you know, I have those, I don't know, but it might be easier because of social media and other technologies. We're leaving traces of ourselves, but I don't know that they're necessarily stories and what kind of impact they would make on creating a being or a soul or an imprint of my essence translated through lineage or ancestry.
Right.
I mean, it's an interesting, doesn't matter, like I go back
Yeah, yeah,
to,
yeah.
you know, I understand what you're saying, that is amazing, because that is, and I have Judaism in my background, in my family, you know, I can see in that context of preservation why it's essential.
Right, and I don't need the future to know me personally, but I do need, for me anyway, to know my history, my family history. It's not about whether they know me in the future, but about whether I know me from the past.
Right.
Also, just because you don't know your ancestors directly or the people in the future, you know, maybe they can't name you because you're their great-great-grandparent or something, but that doesn't mean you don't have an impact on their life because you raised people who in turn raised them. There's a ripple effect through a family. You know, I don't know anything about my grandmother's side of the family because she was in foster care in the 1930s, so we just know nothing about her. But I'm still affected by the things that affected her because she raised my mother and my mother raised me. I'm still a product of those environments in a way, even though I didn't experience them directly.
Just to kind of go with that a little bit, with a lot of indigenous cultures, there's this sense of, well, one of the guiding principles is to consider 7 generations down. That you're living your life for the benefit of seven generations out. So it's not about remembering the individual, but rather the impact that the individual with their community had for 7 generations out.
I was even considering the disconnect when you recall and somebody who would roll in their grave from a decision you made. It's just thinking about how that, because I know people who would say that about just like celebrity figures or even actors or artists, and almost like how ridiculous that seems, but it almost seems like an ancestral connection from how we're discussing it now.
I always feel like that phrase "rolling over in their grave" is so funny because what's so bad about rolling over in your
Take a stretch.
Or like setting he must be setting his grave on fire.
I think the idea is that what you did is like so heinous that it caused a dead body to temporarily swerve.
Roll over.
Like, I think that's the idea.
Squirm?
Yeah.
Yeah, just squirming in his grave. I was thinking also like bringing up this idea of social media, because I feel like the primary form of social media is the body. It maybe still is the most significant form of social media, and that's like the site of primary research as well. You know? Just because you mentioned like your future descendants will be trying to.
I mean, it could look like something else entirely. It could be something we can't even imagine with artificial intelligence. Who knows? If
But
there's not
everything is
some-
here. I mean, everything, all of our inheritances are here. Somewhere here. You know, between here and our feet. All right, let's continue. "17, more than halfway there. In a recent interview, W. Todd Kaneko was asked what inspired him to write his poem, Minidoka Was a Concentration Camp in Idaho, which appears in the recent Asian American issue of the Massachusetts Review. What inspired you to write your poem about this camp? He answered, I remember talking to someone at an editorial meeting who said that readers felt like they just didn't know enough about Minidoka to really understand what my manuscript was about. I tried to write a poem that spells out for people the gravity of Minidoka on our lives. Kaneko's poem begins, I am afraid that all my ancestors have gathered my words like birds. And the poem ends, Minidoka, I say to him, and my ancestors lay fingers across their lips. 18, when someone says they do not know enough, do not give them more of what they are already determined not to know. What you will have to tell them will also not be enough, will only add to the endless inventory of not enough. 19, consider the pilgrimage of Irene Kawai. Irene Kawai is the protagonist of Strawberry Fields, a film by Ria Tajiri and one of my favorite films, Strawberry Fields. Strawberry Fields, which came out in 1997, is the only feature-length film about Japanese American incarceration that does not center a white love interest and or savior. So think of Dennis Quaid in Come See the Paradise, Ethan Hawke in Snow Falling on Cedars. It is also the only feature-length film that centers the perspective of a descendant, Irene Kawai. She's a 16-year-old sansei who, fueled by confusion, frustration, and anger, travels from her home in Chicago to the ruins of the camp in Poston, in Arizona, where her parents and grandparents were incarcerated. When she gets there, the first thing she does, she lies down in the dirt. Later, she drags a homemade bomb into the ruins and detonates it. The bomb explodes, leaving a streak of flame, then a hole. End of film. 20, lie down in the dirt. 20A, detonate a homemade bomb. 21, the filmmaker Ria Tajiri told me once that a friend asked her, aren't you tired of being an internment artist? When she told me this, I laughed, then I grimaced. Such a question might shame a person into re-examining their obsessions and the reasons why they are unable to exorcise them. But it is not a question, it is a reduction and an insult. I wanted to answer on behalf of Tajiri and myself and say, yes, I am tired, but I have only begun. 22, Brin Saito from another poem, I'm worn, I'm tired of their histories. It is okay to be tired, it is okay to be worn, because to be worn is to have covered and protected a body. 23, consider the story of John Yoshida. John Yoshida was incarcerated in the camp in Jerome, Arkansas. He was Kibe, which means he was born in the US, but educated in Japan. On a January morning in 1944, Yoshida escaped from camp and walked to the nearest train tracks. He laid face down on the tracks with his neck on the rail and waited for the train. The train arrived and did not stop. Yoshida's head was separated from his body. He was 23. A letter was found in his pocket. He wrote, I am writing this before I die. If I cannot accomplish what I want, I am going to where my mother and grandmother are. 24, go to where your mother and grandmother are. 25, consider the space between the body and head of John Yoshida. 26, consider the space between the body and head of John Yoshida and go to where your mother and grandmother are. 27, go to where your mother and grandmother are in a letter composed in a simple, straightforward language. 28. What about a family, a community, several generations, an ancestral line of Sisyphuses? One danger of locating a collective trauma in the experience of a single individual is that the collective is extinguished, while the individual, a conquerable yet comprehensible unit of suffering, becomes a hallucination. Consider the writings of the descendants of genocide, forced migration, slavery, mass incarceration, state violence, biocultural assimilation, amnesia, disappearance, etc., as a collective, a body. Each book and poem and paragraph and sentence and line of which is iridescent and worth examining, but integral in the end to the body, which is cumulative, one. 29. Consider, for example, the Japanese jewel bug. The jewel bug tunnels into the scars and beneath the skin of dead or dying trees and lives there, sometimes for many years, and lays its children there, and its children, born into the service of being a jewel bug, tunnel even deeper into the heartwood of the dead or dying trees until the definition of the heartwood of a dead or dying tree becomes the clustering of children around a terminal emptiness. The tunnels jewel bugs carve are the exact circumference of the jewel bug's body, which is brown and black and gold. 30, and final. This is what happens. We go to sleep. We have a dream. Then we wake up and begin largely unconscious process of withdrawing from the dream. The dream does not withdraw from us. We withdraw from it. It is not the dream that does not survive, but we do not survive the loss of the dream. But sometimes we wake up and write down a word or a few words or as much as we can remember of the dream. When we do that, we create, through the mnemonic device of writing, an opening through which the dream flows and is permitted to exist outside the space of dreaming. This is what happens when we write. Even just a word or a few words or as much as we can remember about the past. Our ancestors, for example. We create an opening, however small, through which our ancestors flow and through which they are permitted to exist outside the space of history. We create a ritual space through and in which they can express and realize themselves, maybe even for the first time. So now I want to return to the question I asked about the first name or names that came to your mind when I ask an individual or individual you have never met, but to whom you feel an intense connection. Who wants to just share what they wrote?
I wrote Jews, my father's extended family, my Uncle George, World War II, the Russian Revolution.
Yeah, let's just fill the room.